All right, welcome everyone. Let's dive deep into Richard Wright's Native Son.
Sounds good.
We'll be exploring the novel, but also some of Wright's own thoughts and, his reflections on how it all came together.
Awesome.
And for those of you who haven't read it yet, don't worry. We'll break down all the important stuff, the key insights and aha moments.
Yep, absolutely.
What's particularly cool about this deep dive is that we're going a bit further. We're not just looking at the story itself. We're going to compare Bigger Thomas, the main character, to the actual people and events that inspired Wright. It's pretty amazing how Wright was inspired by an actual murder case, the Robert Nixon case.
Yeah, he used newspaper clippings.
Yeah.
Especially the ones about racial bias
Wow.
to shape the plot of Native Son.
That is crazy. It's like, looking back in time
Yeah.
to see how real-world events led to such a powerful story, it makes you wonder how many fictional stories are actually based on real events.
It's a chilling thought, for sure.
Yeah, and it gets even more intense when you remember that Nixon confessed to another murder and he was eventually executed.
Right. Wright even added details from the case into Native Son, like the murder weapon, a brick.
Whoa. Blurring those lines between fiction and reality.
Definitely.
Okay, so let's get into Bigger's world now. The novel starts with a really vivid scene. Bigger and his family are getting dressed in their small apartment.
Right.
Immediately, you feel how poor they are and the tension in their family dynamic.
It's a great scene to establish the family dynamic right from the start. They all try to avoid shame, everyone looking away while others get dressed. It highlights a lack of privacy and the struggle for dignity in such a small space.
Yeah, it's like they're trying to keep a sense of normalcy in a world that's constantly taking away their dignity. And then we have that conversation between Bigger and his mother. She's pushing him, wanting him to be ambitious, to make something of himself. But Bigger just shuts down, calls her a prophet, for predicting he'll end up regretting his choices.
This contrast between Bigger's dreams and the reality he's stuck in is so important to understanding him. He dreams of flying, of escaping, but his limited opportunities make him feel hopeless.
Exactly. And then there's that poster of Buckley, the corrupt politician. You see it everywhere. It's a symbol of the unattainable American dream for someone like Bigger.
Yeah, it's not just a random detail, it's very symbolic.
He sees Buckley's wealth and power as something he can't have, making him feel even more trapped.
Exactly. It fuels his anger and resentment.
Yeah.
He starts to see the system as working against him. This leads to the scene where Bigger suggests robbing Bloom's store with his friends. It's where you really see the appeal of crime taking hold.
It's a fascinating look at how the group interacts and Bigger's internal struggle, too. He's scared of robbing a white man, but even more scared or appearing weak in front of his friends.
Right.
He manipulates them, almost taunting them until they finally agree.
His fear of being seen as weak, this need to prove himself in a world that tells him he's less than, leads him to make some really bad choices.
It's like a cycle of fear and trying to act tough.
Right.
A theme that, sadly, a lot of young men face, especially when they feel like they have no options. And this all brings us to that night with Mary Dalton. You can feel the tension from the moment they meet. Bigger is so uncomfortable around her and her boyfriend, Jan.
Wright is really skillful in using contrasting scenes to create this sense of something bad about to happen. We have the tense car ride with Mary and Jan where Bigger feels completely lost. And then there's a brief moment of escape in the movie theater scene, a small escape before everything goes wrong.
And then, of course, Mary's death. Wright's description of how it happens is so powerful. It was an accident, but Bigger immediately takes the blame. It's a really sad moment.
Yeah, the line that stood out to me is, he was black and he'd been alone in a room where a white girl had been killed, therefore he had killed her.
Yeah.
It made me think about how quickly people make assumptions, especially when there's prejudice involved.
Yeah, it makes you think about how easy it is to judge someone based on their race.
Absolutely. And Bigger's actions after Mary's death are driven by fear and a desperate attempt to gain control. He burns the body, plants the communist pamphlets. He's trying to shift the blame.
It's like some twisted chess game.
Yeah.
He's terrified of getting caught, but he's also surprisingly clever in trying to cover his tracks.
There's also this interesting irony here. Bigger rejects religion, thinks it's for weak people, but he's also very superstitious, scared by his mother's warnings about his future. It's like he can't escape those deep anxieties, that feeling that something bad is going to happen.
So for our listeners, just to clarify, irony is when something happens that's the opposite of what's expected. So here, Bigger rejects religion, but is actually still trapped by another belief system. He's fighting against one thing while still being controlled by another.
That's a great explanation. It shows how complex Bigger's internal struggle is. He's trying to have control over his life, but he's constantly battling these deep fears.
It's a struggle that goes beyond this story, right?
Definitely.
And then Bessie gets involved. Bigger confesses to her, and they come up with this desperate plan to ask for ransom. Even though they're both afraid, Bessie's words reflect Bigger's feeling of being trapped.
Her line, "We's black, we can't go just anywhere," is a stark reminder of the few options they have. They're both trapped by their circumstances, by the prejudice that surrounds them.
It's a sad moment of shared hopelessness. And this leads to the scary furnace scene. The smoke from Mary's body is what gives Bigger away. It's like his actions are consuming him.
Yeah, the imagery is so powerful there. It shows how he can't escape what he's done. And then we see Bigger facing the newspaper headline, "Hunt Black in Girl's Death."
Whoa.
It's a stark reminder of how alone he is.
He's been labeled a rapist, which is a death sentence in the eyes of white society back then, regardless of the truth.
Yeah,
It doesn't matter what actually happened, the perception is what seals his fate.
it's true. Yeah, it really shows how prejudice can be so powerful and how easily fear can be used against people. But even in all this darkness, there are moments of humanity that stand out. Max's relationship with Bigger, for example, is really complex.
That's true. Max doesn't see Bigger as a monster, but as a human trapped by his circumstances. It's like he's trying to understand what's going on inside Bigger to connect with him on a deeper level.
Exactly. And he does that by challenging Bigger, making him think about his choices and why he made them. Max isn't okay with what Bigger did, but he tries to explain it, to put it in a bigger context.
You know, this reminds me of something you mentioned earlier about Bigger number two, the one who was defiant and kind of opportunistic. Could you tell us more about those real-life Biggers who inspired Wright?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Wright met a lot of men who had that same anger and rebelliousness that Bigger has. Like you said, there was Bigger number two, always trying to use the system to survive. Then there's Bigger number four. He was the one driven to insanity by the pressures of a world that wouldn't see him as human.
It's heartbreaking to think about the real people behind those stories. They weren't just characters. They were real people trying to live in a system that kept them down.
Yeah, and then there's Bigger number five. He stood up to the conductor on that segregated streetcar. Refused to go to the back, refused to be treated as less than.
These stories about the real-life Biggers really show how widespread these issues were. They were a part of society. It's not about just one person. It's about a whole system that creates and keeps these conditions going.
Exactly, and that's what makes Bigger Thomas such a powerful and lasting symbol. He represents anyone who has felt trapped, dehumanized, denied basic rights. It goes beyond race and time.
Right, you even said Bigger Thomas was not black all the time. He was white, too. That's a pretty deep statement. What do you think he meant by that?
Well, that's a really important point. He was saying that Bigger's story, even though it comes from the black experience, it also speaks to everyone who feels fear and alienation. It goes beyond race.
It's like he's saying we all have a bit of Bigger Thomas in us that need to be seen and understood, and the fear of being trapped and dehumanized.
Absolutely. It's about the basic human need to be free and make your own choices. And when those needs aren't met, when people are pushed too far, they're capable of anything, even terrible violence.
Makes you wonder, if Bigger Thomas was alive today, would his story be different? What about the systems that are still in place today? I wonder what our listeners think about that.
Yeah, that's a really good question to think about. And while our deep dive is coming to an end, I hope this conversation keeps going.
I agree. Native Son is a book that needs to be talked about and debated. It makes us face the hard truths about the world we live in. So as we wrap up, what would you say is the most important thing we've learned in this deep dive?
I think it's realizing that we have a responsibility to challenge injustice and to work towards a fairer society. We can't just stay silent. We can't ignore the Bigger Thomases of our time. Their stories are important. Their lives matter.
I couldn't agree more. And it's so important to really listen to those stories, to try and understand the desperation and anger that can drive people to do such extreme things. It's not about agreeing with violence. It's about seeing the humanity in everyone, even those who have done terrible things.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. It's about recognizing those shared experiences, those fears and hopes that we all have. And ultimately, it's about creating a world where everyone has a chance to live a good and meaningful life without fear and oppression.
Wow, this deep dive has been eye-opening. Native Son really makes you think long after you finished reading it. It makes you question things and face your own assumptions.
It's a powerful and important book for anyone who wants to understand race, class, and justice. And it reminds us that the fight for equality is not over.
If you haven't read it, I really recommend checking it out. It's a book that deserves to be read, talked about, and debated for years to come.
For sure, it's a classic. Yeah, it really makes you think and question things. It's not just about Bigger himself. It's about the society that made him who he is. Makes you think about what's still going on today.
It's definitely not an easy read, that's for sure. But these tough topics are so important to talk about. So much of what Wright was writing about back then is still relevant now.
Exactly. Racism, poverty, the justice system, it's all still there. Native Son reminds us that these aren't just problems in theory, they have real impacts on people's lives.
You know, it makes me think about how these things connect and how they can trap people in cycles of violence and despair. We were talking earlier about the biggers beyond the book. Can we go back to that for a sec?
Absolutely. Those real-life stories add so much to the novel. Remember Bigger number 2,
Hmm.
the one who was so defiant, the one who used the system to survive.
Yeah.
Or Bigger number 4, driven to madness by a world that wouldn't accept him.
And bigger number 5, who stood up to the conductor on that segregated streetcar. He wouldn't be treated as less than. It's easy to forget that these weren't just made up. They were based on real people that Wright knew, real lives affected by the same things that shaped Bigger Thomas.
It's what makes the story feel so real and disturbing. It shows just how big these issues were, how deeply they were a part of society.
Wright said, Bigger Thomas was not black all the time, he was white too, and that feels important. What was he getting at with that?
That's a crucial point. He was showing that even though Bigger's story comes from the Black experience, it also speaks to a wider human experience of fear and feeling like an outsider. It's something everyone can relate to.
So it's like there's a little bit of Bigger Thomas in all of us that need to be seen, to be understood, that fear of being trapped and dehumanized.
Exactly. It's that basic human need to be free and make your own choices. And when people are denied that, when they're pushed too far, they can do anything, even awful, violent things.
It really makes you think, would Bigger Thomas's story be different if he lived now? What about all the systems that are still in place? I'd love to hear what our listeners think.
That's a fantastic question for everyone to consider. As we finish up this deep dive, I really hope people keep talking about this.
Me too. Native Son is a book that makes you think and discuss and argue. It forces us to look at the difficult parts of our world. So, to wrap things up, what would you say is the biggest thing we've learned?
I think it's realizing that we have to do something about injustice. We have to fight for a fairer world. We can't just stay quiet. We can't ignore the Bigger Thomases of our time. Their stories matter. Their lives matter.
Yeah, I agree completely. And it's so important to really listen to their stories, to try and understand the desperation and anger that can make people do such extreme things. It's not about being okay with violence. It's about seeing the humanity in all of us, even the people who have done terrible things.
That's beautifully said. It's about recognizing the experiences we share, the fears and hopes that connect us. And in the end, it's about making a world where everyone can live a good and meaningful life without fear and oppression.
Wow, what an eye-opening deep dive this has been. Native Son is one of those books that stays with you long after you finished it. It really makes you think and question your own ideas.
Absolutely. It's a powerful book, essential for anyone who wants to understand race, class, and justice. It's a reminder that the fight for equality isn't over.
So if you haven't read it yet, I highly recommend you check it out. It's a book that needs to be read and talked about for a long time to come.
I totally agree. Until next time, everyone, keep on diving deep.